He's my boyfriend. Sophie Carter heard herself say before her brain had time to catch up with the words leaving her mouth. The lie floated into the glittering air of the ballroom like a spark in a room full of dry leaves, small but dangerous. And suddenly, every conversation around them seemed to slow just enough for the moment to feel impossibly loud. The charity gala inside the Grand Harbor Hotel shimmered with gold chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. A jazz trio played near the stage, their smooth notes drifting through the crowd of investors, executives, and socialites who all looked like they belonged in magazines Sophie could never afford to subscribe to. Sophie, on the other hand, was just trying not to spill the sparkling water in her hand while delivering a folder of documents her boss needed signed before the end of the night. Her navy dress was borrowed from a friend. The heels on her feet pinched just enough to remind her that she wasn't used to places like this, and the name badge clipped inside her purse labeled her clearly as staff, not guest. She had planned to slip in, hand the folder to Adrian Blake, and leave quietly before anyone noticed her. But fate had other plans. Because standing across the room, near the champagne tower, was Ryan Mitchell. Ryan with the perfect hair and the expensive watch and the smile that used to make Sophie believe the world was kind. Ryan, who had once promised her forever in a tiny coffee shop in Brooklyn before leaving 6 months later for someone whose family owned half the city's real estate. Sophie had hoped she would never see him again. Apparently, the universe had a sense of humor. Ryan noticed her almost instantly, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with the same familiar smirk she remembered too well. "Sophie Carter," he said as he walked over, his tone smooth but sharp around the edges. "I didn't expect to see you here. Let me guess, catering." The words landed softly but carried enough sting to make her cheeks warm. Sophie forced a polite smile, gripping the folder a little tighter. "Actually, I work here," she replied carefully. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Right. Assistant life, huh? Must be exciting." A few nearby guests glanced over, sensing the tension the way people always do at events like this. Sophie's heart began to pound, every old memory rushing back at once. She could feel that familiar, helpless feeling creeping up again, the same one she had promised herself she would never feel around Ryan Mitchell ever again. She looked around quickly for an escape, and that's when she saw him. Adrian Blake stood only a few feet away speaking with two board members, tall and composed in a black tuxedo that somehow made the entire room look like it belonged to him. At 34, he had built Blake Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, and every business magazine in America seemed to have his face on the cover at least once a year. To Sophie, he was simply the boss whose schedule she organized and whose coffee she remembered exactly the way he liked it. Adrian finished his conversation and turned just as Sophie's eyes landed on him, and in that split-second panic made the decision for her. She stepped forward, slipped her hand lightly around his arm, and faced Ryan with the brightest smile she could manage. "Ryan," she said calmly, "this is Adrian, my boyfriend." For half a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to pause. Ryan blinked in disbelief. And Adrian Blake, billionaire CEO of the company she worked for, slowly looked down at Sophie Carter like he had just been cast into a story he hadn't been warned about. Adrian Blake did not pull his arm away. For a moment, he simply looked at Sophie, his expression unreadable, dark eyes studying her with the calm precision he used in board meetings when investors were trying to guess his next move. The music continued to drift through the ballroom, and the quiet murmur of conversations returned around them, but Ryan Mitchell was still staring like someone had just rewritten the rules of the evening. Sophie could feel Adrian's sleeve beneath her fingers and suddenly realized what she had done. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain both men could hear it. Ryan gave a slow laugh that did not sound amused. "Your boyfriend?" he repeated, glancing between them. "You mean Adrian Blake?" "The Adrian Blake." Sophie forced her smile to stay steady, even though every instinct told her to run straight toward the exit. Before she could say anything else, Adrian finally spoke. His voice was calm, warm, and perfectly controlled. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending his hand toward Ryan like the introduction had been planned all along. "Ryan, is it?" Ryan hesitated before shaking it, clearly trying to decide whether this was a joke. "Yes," he said carefully. "Ryan Mitchell." Adrian nodded politely. "Sophie has mentioned you before." That sentence was a lie Sophie knew instantly, because she had never once spoken about Ryan at the office. But Adrian delivered it so smoothly that Ryan's confident expression flickered for just a second. Ryan glanced at Sophie again. I did not realize you two were dating. Sophie opened her mouth, but Adrian answered first. It is fairly new, he said casually, resting his hand lightly against Sophie's back as if the gesture had always belonged there. The contact was brief and respectful, but it made the story suddenly feel more believable. We were hoping to keep it quiet for a while. Ryan crossed his arms slowly, suspicion sharpening his voice. Funny, because a minute ago she looked surprised to see you. Adrian smiled slightly, the kind of relaxed smile that had probably helped him negotiate billion-dollar deals. That is because she was not expecting me tonight, he replied. I decided to stop by after a late meeting. Sophie stared at him in quiet amazement. He was improvising every second of this and somehow making it sound effortless. Ryan studied them both, clearly searching for cracks in the story. Around them, several guests had begun paying subtle attention, pretending to sip champagne while listening closely. Ryan tilted his head toward Adrian. So the two of you work together and date? He asked. That seems complicated. Adrian did not hesitate. Only if you make it complicated. Ryan gave a short laugh again, though this one carried less confidence. Right. He looked back at Sophie. Well, congratulations. You certainly upgraded. The words sounded like a compliment, but carried the familiar edge Sophie remembered too well. Adrian's voice remained calm. Sophie does not measure people that way. Ryan met Adrian's eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. After a moment, Ryan shrugged lightly. Good to know, he said, though the tension in his jaw remained. Enjoy the party. He turned and walked back toward the champagne tower, disappearing into the crowd of guests. The moment he was gone, Sophie exhaled a breath she did not realize she had been holding. For a second, she still clung to Adrian's arm before quickly stepping back, embarrassment rushing across her face. I am so sorry, she said quietly. I should not have done that. Adrian looked at her, then glanced across the ballroom where Ryan had vanished. The faintest trace of amusement appeared in his eyes. Next time, he said calmly, you might want to warn the man you are promoting to boyfriend. Sophie groaned softly and covered her face for a second. I panicked. Adrian studied her for another moment before something thoughtful crossed his expression. Then he looked back toward the crowd, straightened his jacket slightly, and said in a tone that was almost playful, well, if we are going to continue this story, we should probably make it believable. Adrian Blake did not rush away after saying that. Instead, he remained beside Sophie as the music drifted through the ballroom and the conversations around them slowly returned to normal. Sophie lowered her hands from her face and looked up at him, still mortified by the situation she had created. I promise I will fix this, she said quietly. You do not have to play along anymore. Adrian raised one eyebrow slightly, the same thoughtful expression he often had in meetings when someone suggested a risky idea. Unfortunately, he said calmly, I believe that ship may have already sailed. Sophie blinked in confusion. Adrian gave a small nod toward the far side of the ballroom. Sophie followed his gaze and immediately felt her stomach drop. Ryan Mitchell had not left the party. He stood near a group of investors, but he was very clearly watching them. Not casually either. Curiously, like a man waiting to see if the performance would fall apart. Sophie sighed softly. He does not believe us, she murmured. Adrian folded his arms comfortably, studying the room like a strategist looking at a chessboard. No, he said. He definitely does not. Sophie glanced around and realized something else that made the situation worse. Several other guests had begun paying quiet attention as well. Adrian Blake was one of the most recognizable business figures in the country. If people thought he had brought a girlfriend to the event, especially someone none of them recognized, the curiosity would spread quickly. Sophie rubbed her temples lightly. This is a disaster. Adrian did not look concerned. In fact, the faintest hint of amusement returned to his eyes. Not necessarily, he said. But if we are continuing the story you started, we should probably make it convincing. Sophie stared at him. You mean keep pretending? Adrian looked down at her like the question was obvious. Only for a few minutes, he replied. Long enough for your former boyfriend to lose interest. Sophie hesitated. Every rational thought in her head told her this was a terrible idea. But when she glanced across the ballroom again, she saw Ryan still watching, waiting, judging, the same way he had always done when they were together. A small spark of determination rose in her chest. Sophie straightened her shoulders. Fine, she said quietly. What do we do? Adrian's expression shifted slightly, like a man who had just accepted a challenge. He looked toward the long balcony doors that overlooked the harbor, where several couples were standing and talking beneath the string lights. Couples do not stand on opposite sides of the room, he said calmly. Sophie nodded slowly. Right. Adrian extended his hand with a polite confidence that looked entirely natural in the elegant room around them. Then shall we? Sophie placed her hand in his, trying to ignore the way her heart started beating faster again. Adrian guided her through the crowd toward the balcony with the relaxed ease of someone who had attended hundreds of events like this. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air drifted across the harbor and the distant city lights shimmered on the water. A few guests glanced toward them and then politely looked away, the way people always do when they assume they are witnessing a private moment. Adrian leaned lightly against the railing beside her and looked out across the dark water. You handled Ryan well, he said after a moment. Sophie let out a small laugh. I handled him terribly. I lied and dragged my boss into it. Adrian turned slightly toward her, studying her expression. You were trying to protect your pride, he said simply. Sophie looked at him, surprised by the calm understanding in his voice. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted from behind them. Well, Ryan Mitchell said slowly, stepping onto the balcony. This is interesting. Ryan Mitchell stepped onto the balcony with the slow confidence of someone who believed he had just caught the final act of a performance. The soft glow of string lights reflected in the harbor behind him, while the distant sound of the jazz band drifted out from the ballroom doors. Sophie felt her shoulders tense instantly. For a moment, she considered simply walking away, but Adrian Blake remained calmly beside her, his posture relaxed against the railing as though unexpected interruptions at charity galas were a normal part of his evening. Ryan glanced between them with an amused smile that did not reach his eyes. I did not realize the balcony was part of the romantic tour, he said lightly. Sophie forced herself to keep her composure. Ryan, do not you have people waiting for you inside? She replied. Ryan shrugged and leaned against the nearby pillar. They can wait. I was just curious. His gaze shifted toward Adrian again. You two seem very comfortable for a relationship that is apparently brand new. Adrian did not react to the comment right away. He looked out over the water for a moment, as if considering the view rather than the challenge in Ryan's voice. Then he turned back calmly. Sometimes the right person makes things feel easy, he said. Ryan chuckled softly. That is a very polished answer. Sophie could feel the tension building again, like a quiet storm gathering in the warm summer air. She remembered too, how Ryan liked to corner people with small questions until they made a mistake. Ryan folded his arms. You know, he continued casually, Sophie used to hate these kinds of parties. Too many people pretending to be impressive. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. That had been a private conversation years ago in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a broken window fan. Adrian glanced at her briefly and then looked back at Ryan. People change, Adrian said simply. Ryan tilted his head slightly. Do they, he asked. Or do they just find better opportunities? The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian spoke first, his voice still calm and even. Ryan, I get the impression you believe this relationship is not real. Ryan smiled faintly. I believe what I see. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, as if Ryan had just made a reasonable point in a business meeting. Then he looked towards Sophie for a moment. Something quiet passed through his expression, almost like a silent question. Sophie felt her pulse quicken again, though she could not explain why. Ryan pushed himself away from the pillar. Look, he said with a casual shrug. I just think if you were going to tell a story like that, you should at least make it convincing. The music from inside the ballroom swelled briefly as the doors opened and closed behind a group of guests. Sophie noticed that two people standing near the balcony entrance were clearly watching them now, curiosity written across their faces. The story she had started was spreading faster than she expected. Adrian noticed it too. He looked back at Ryan, his expression steady. Convincing, he repeated thoughtfully. Ryan nodded. Exactly. For a second, the only sound was the soft movement of water against the harbor docks far below. Then Adrian turned towards Sophie fully, his expression suddenly more decisive than before. All right, he said quietly. Ryan raised an eyebrow in confusion. Sophie barely had time to process what Adrian meant before he gently took her hand again and stepped a little closer, his voice calm but firm as he spoke the words that made Ryan freeze where he stood. "If convincing is what you need," Adrian said evenly, "then perhaps we should make it clear." For a brief second, Sophie Carter forgot how to breathe. Adrian Blake's hand was warm around hers, steady and calm, and before her mind could catch up with the moment, he stepped slightly closer, closing the small space between them as though it had always belonged that way. Ryan Mitchell straightened where he stood near the balcony pillar, clearly expecting another clever explanation or polished line. Instead, Adrian simply looked at Sophie for a quiet moment, his expression thoughtful rather than dramatic, as if asking for silent permission. Sophie did not move. The distant jazz music floated through the warm night air, and the lights of the harbor shimmered behind them like scattered stars. Then Adrian leaned in and kissed her. It was not a reckless or theatrical gesture. It was gentle, calm, and certain, the kind of moment that made the rest of the world fade into the background for a few quiet seconds. Sophie's mind went completely blank. She had expected another smooth sentence, another strategic move to win the argument Ryan had started. She had not expected this. Somewhere behind them, someone inside the ballroom laughed loudly, and the balcony doors opened and closed again, but the moment felt strangely still. When Adrian finally stepped back, his expression remained composed, though there was a faint softness in his eyes that had not been there before. Sophie realized she was staring at him and quickly turned her attention toward Ryan. The reaction was immediate. Ryan's confident posture had vanished, replaced by the kind of stunned disbelief that appears when someone realizes they have just lost a game they thought they were winning. He blinked once, then twice, clearly searching for the right response and finding none. Adrian spoke first, his voice calm and respectful as always. "Is that convincing enough?" he asked. Ryan opened his mouth slightly before closing it again. The sarcastic smile he usually wore had disappeared entirely. For the first time since Sophie had known him, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. "I see," Ryan said slowly, though it was obvious he had not expected the situation to go this far. He glanced between them one more time, as if hoping to find some hidden sign that the moment had been staged. Instead, he only saw Sophie still standing beside Adrian, her hand still lightly in his. Ryan let out a quiet breath and forced a thin smile. "Well," he said, adjusting the cuff of his expensive jacket, "that certainly answers the question." The tension that had filled the balcony moments earlier seemed to drain away as he stepped toward the door leading back into the ballroom. Before leaving, he paused briefly beside Sophie, though his voice was noticeably less confident than before. "Good to see you doing well," he said. Then he walked inside and disappeared into the crowd. For several seconds, neither Sophie nor Adrian moved. The harbor lights reflected quietly across the dark water while the music continued inside the ballroom. Sophie slowly released Adrian's hand and covered her mouth with one hand, half shocked and half embarrassed. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "I cannot believe that just happened." Adrian leaned lightly against the railing again as if nothing unusual had occurred. "You asked for convincing," he said calmly. Sophie stared at him in disbelief. "You kissed me." Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Sophie let out a small, incredulous laugh and shook her head. "That was not part of the plan." Adrian glanced toward the ballroom where Ryan had vanished and then back toward Sophie, his expression thoughtful again. "No," he admitted quietly. "It was not." For several quiet seconds, Sophie Carter simply stood there staring at Adrian Blake while the cool night air from the harbor brushed gently across the balcony. Her mind was still trying to process the moment that had just happened. A few minutes earlier, she had been delivering a folder at a charity gala and trying to avoid her ex-boyfriend. Now she had somehow kissed the billionaire CEO she worked for, and half the guests inside the ballroom had probably witnessed the moment. Sophie slowly lowered her hand from her mouth and shook her head in disbelief. "I cannot believe you actually did that," she said softly. Adrian looked out toward the water again, the reflection of the harbor lights dancing across the dark surface below. His posture remained relaxed, as though the situation had not changed the evening at all. "It solved the problem," he replied calmly. Sophie laughed quietly, though there was still nervous energy in her voice. "It solved the Ryan problem. It might have created about 10 new ones." Adrian glanced back toward the ballroom doors where soft music and laughter continued to drift outside. "Possibly," he admitted. Sophie leaned against the railing beside him and took a slow breath. Now that Ryan was gone, the tension that had been building all evening was finally beginning to fade, but a new kind of awkwardness had taken its place. She had worked for Adrian Blake for almost 2 years. In the office, he was professional, focused, and famously private about his personal life. The business magazines loved to speculate about who he dated, but Sophie had never seen him bring anyone to company events before. And now the entire ballroom probably believed she was his girlfriend. Sophie rubbed her forehead lightly. People inside definitely saw that, she said. Adrian nodded slightly. Yes. Sophie looked at him again. Which means by tomorrow morning the entire company will think I am dating my boss. Adrian considered that for a moment with surprising calm. That is a possibility. Sophie blinked. A possibility? Adrian, the board members are inside. Investors are inside. The press coordinator from Business Weekly is probably inside. Adrian gave a small, thoughtful smile. Then we should expect questions. Sophie stared at him. You are incredibly calm about this. Adrian folded his arms lightly against the railing and looked out across the harbor again before answering. When people already believe a story, he said quietly, it is usually easier to let them believe it than to explain a complicated truth. Sophie frowned slightly. You mean we should just pretend nothing happened? Adrian turned his head slightly toward her. No, he said. We should pretend exactly what they think happened. Sophie's eyes widened. You cannot be serious. Adrian met her gaze with the same steady confidence he carried into boardrooms filled with skeptical investors. Think about it, he said. If we suddenly deny everything tonight, it will only create more attention. People will speculate. They will gossip. And Ryan Mitchell will certainly enjoy telling everyone his version of the story. Sophie groaned quietly. So the solution is to pretend we are actually dating? Adrian paused for a moment before answering. For the rest of the evening, he said. Sophie stared at him in stunned silence. Adrian straightened his jacket slightly and nodded toward the ballroom doors where music and laughter continued to spill into the night air. Shall we go back inside? He added calmly, before our audience starts wondering where the happy couple disappeared to. The moment they stepped back into the ballroom, Sophie Carter immediately understood what Adrian meant about the audience. Conversations did not stop completely, but they slowed just enough that the shift in attention was impossible to miss. The soft jazz music continued from the small stage near the center of the room. Glasses clinked, and waiters carried silver trays through clusters of elegantly dressed guests. But several people subtly turned their heads as Adrian Blake and Sophie walked in together. Sophie felt the weight of 100 curious glances before they had taken 5 steps across the marble floor. Adrian, however, looked perfectly at ease. His posture remained relaxed and confident, the same calm presence he always carried into important meetings. Without hesitation, he gently rested his hand at the small of Sophie's back, guiding her forward through the crowd in a way that looked natural enough to anyone watching. Sophie kept her expression composed even though her mind was racing. This was no longer just a quick lie to avoid an awkward conversation with Ryan. This had turned into a full performance. A tall man in a gray suit approached them almost immediately. Sophie recognized him as Daniel Whitmore, one of the senior investors in Blake Dynamics. Daniel raised his glass with a knowing smile. Adrian, he said warmly, you have been holding out on us. Adrian returned the smile with easy politeness. Good evening, Daniel. Daniel's eyes shifted towards Sophie with open curiosity. Are you going to introduce us to the woman who just stole the spotlight on your balcony? Sophie felt her cheeks warm slightly, but Adrian spoke before she could panic. Of course, Adrian said smoothly. Daniel, this is Sophie Carter. Daniel nodded politely. Pleasure to meet you. Sophie shook his hand. Nice to meet you as well. Daniel looked between them with clear amusement. I must say, Adrian, this is the most interesting surprise of the evening. Adrian simply smiled. Life can be unpredictable. Daniel chuckled before being pulled away by another group of guests, leaving Sophie standing beside Adrian again. Sophie leaned slightly closer to him and lowered her voice. They definitely saw everything. Adrian nodded calmly. Yes. Sophie glanced around the room again. 2 women near the bar were whispering to each other while glancing toward them. A photographer from the charity event committee was also nearby, adjusting his camera lens. Sophie suddenly realized how quickly rumors could spread in a room filled with business leaders, journalists, and donors. This is getting bigger, she murmured. Adrian followed her gaze briefly and then looked back at her. Which means we should keep the story consistent. Sophie exhaled slowly. You are frighteningly good at this. Adrian allowed a faint smile. Running a company requires some acting skills. Just then a familiar voice from behind them said, Adrian, there you are. Both of them turned to see Claire Matthews approaching. Claire was Adrian's executive assistant and the person who managed nearly every detail of his schedule. She was also Sophie's direct supervisor. Claire stopped a few feet away and looked at them carefully, her expression thoughtful. Her eyes moved from Adrian's relaxed posture to Sophie's slightly flushed face, and then back again. Interesting evening, Claire said calmly. Sophie felt a new wave of nervousness rise in her chest. Claire Matthews missed nothing. Adrian remained completely composed. It appears that way, he said. Claire studied them for another moment before crossing her arms with mild curiosity. Would either of you like to explain why half the donors in this room think? The CEO of Blake Dynamics just introduced his girlfriend to the world. Claire Matthews waited patiently, her arms still folded as she looked between Adrian Blake and Sophie Carter with the sharp attention of someone who managed crises for a living. Sophie felt her stomach tighten because if anyone in the company could dismantle their carefully improvised story in 30 seconds, it was Claire. Adrian, however, showed no sign of concern. He simply met Claire's gaze with calm composure. It appears the evening has become more interesting than expected, he said. Claire tilted her head slightly. That is one way to describe it, she replied. Another way would be that our very private CEO just created the most talked about moment of the entire charity gala. Sophie opened her mouth, but Adrian spoke first again. Sophie and I were hoping to keep things quiet for a while, he said evenly. Claire raised one eyebrow, clearly unconvinced but also curious enough to listen. Quiet, she repeated. Adrian, half the people in this room just saw you kiss someone on the balcony. Sophie felt heat rush to her face again. Adrian nodded as though Claire had made a reasonable observation. Yes, he said. Claire looked at Sophie then, studying her expression carefully. Sophie suddenly realized Claire was not angry. She was analyzing the situation like a puzzle. And when exactly did this relationship begin? Claire asked calmly. Sophie hesitated, but Adrian answered without missing a beat. Recently. Claire sighed softly and glanced around the ballroom, where whispers and glances were still quietly spreading between guests. Well, she said after a moment, whether it is recent or not, the story is already out there. Sophie rubbed her hands together nervously. I am really sorry, Claire, she said quietly. This was not supposed to become all of this. Claire studied her for another moment before her expression softened slightly. Sophie, I am not worried about you, she said. I am worried about the headlines tomorrow morning. Adrian nodded slightly. Public speculation is unavoidable now. Claire gave him a long look. You realize the press coordinator from Business Weekly is standing 20 feet away and already pretending not to stare. Adrian glanced briefly across the room and saw the woman Claire mentioned speaking quietly with a photographer while clearly watching them. He returned his attention to Claire with the same calm demeanor. Then we should give them nothing scandalous to speculate about. Claire crossed her arms again. Meaning? Adrian answered simply. Meaning we behave like a normal couple attending a charity event. Sophie blinked in surprise. Claire stared at him for several seconds, clearly weighing the logic behind the idea. Slowly a small, reluctant smile appeared on her face. You know, Claire said, that might actually be the least chaotic solution. Sophie looked between them in disbelief. Wait, she said. You are both agreeing with this? Claire shrugged lightly. At this point, denying everything would only create a bigger story. Adrian nodded once in quiet agreement. Claire looked back toward the ballroom floor where the band had just begun playing a slower song and several couples were drifting toward the dance area. Then she looked back at Adrian and Sophie with a thoughtful expression. If you two are going to convince everyone this is real, she said calmly, standing awkwardly in the corner is not going to help. Sophie had a terrible feeling she knew what Claire was about to suggest. Claire gestured toward the dance floor with a small smile. Go dance. Sophie stared at her. Dance. Adrian looked toward the floor where couples were beginning to move slowly beneath the golden lights of the ballroom. After a quiet second, he turned toward Sophie and offered his hand again with effortless confidence. Shall we continue the performance? For a moment, Sophie Carter simply stared at Adrian Blake's outstretched hand as the music from the band shifted into a slow, elegant melody that floated across the ballroom. Around them, couples were already stepping onto the dance floor beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, their movements graceful and relaxed, as if evenings like this happened every day. Sophie, however, felt like she had accidentally walked onto a stage without knowing the script. Claire Matthews watched them both with quiet expectation, clearly convinced that this was now the most practical way to maintain their story. Adrian kept his hand extended patiently, his expression calm and slightly amused. "It would help the narrative," he said quietly. Sophie exhaled slowly and placed her hand in his. "This narrative is getting very complicated," she murmured. Adrian's faint smile returned. "Most convincing stories are." He guided her gently toward the center of the ballroom, where the dance floor had begun to fill with guests. As they stepped into the open space, Sophie became painfully aware of how many eyes were still quietly following them. The woman from Business Weekly stood near the edge of the floor speaking with the photographer Claire had mentioned earlier. The camera lens shifted slightly in their direction. Sophie leaned closer to Adrian as they stopped among the other couples. "We definitely have an audience," she whispered. Adrian nodded once. "Then we should not disappoint them." The band played a smooth jazz waltz, and Adrian placed one hand lightly at Sophie's waist while taking her other hand in his. The gesture was respectful and natural, but it still sent a small wave of nervous energy through Sophie because the situation felt so unreal. "Relax," Adrian said quietly. "I promise I will not let you fall." Sophie looked up at him. "I am less worried about falling and more worried about becoming tomorrow morning's headline." Adrian began guiding her slowly across the dance floor with effortless confidence. "Headlines tend to lose interest quickly when nothing dramatic follows," he replied. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You say that like you have experience with unexpected publicity." Adrian chuckled softly. "Running a company attracts attention whether you want it or not." As they moved through the slow rhythm of the music, Sophie gradually realized that Adrian was an excellent dancer. His movements were steady and natural, guiding her without pressure so that the steps felt almost effortless. A few guests smiled as they passed, some offering quiet greetings to Adrian, others clearly observing the moment with curiosity. Sophie noticed Daniel Whitmore near the bar again, raising his glass toward them with an approving grin. "Your investor seems entertained," she said quietly. Adrian glanced briefly in Daniel's direction. Daniel enjoys surprises. Sophie allowed herself a small laugh, the tension in her shoulders finally easing slightly. The music swelled gently around them, and the lights reflected softly from the polished floor beneath their feet. For a brief moment, the entire evening felt less like a crisis and more like a strange, elegant dream. Adrian looked down at her again, studying her expression. "You are doing well," he said calmly. Sophie smiled faintly. "That is because you are leading." Adrian paused slightly at that comment before speaking again. "Sometimes leading is simply about making someone feel safe enough to keep moving." Sophie was about to respond when she noticed something over Adrian's shoulder that caused her smile to fade slightly. Standing near the edge of the dance floor with a tense expression was Ryan Mitchell, watching the two of them closely once again. Sophie Carter's smile faded slightly the moment she noticed Ryan Mitchell standing near the edge of the dance floor. His expression was tight, the confident amusement he had worn earlier replaced by something sharper and more focused. He was watching every step Adrian Blake and Sophie took across the polished floor as the band continued playing its slow melody. Sophie instinctively tensed, but Adrian's hand remained steady at her waist, guiding her smoothly through the rhythm of the dance. "Do not look so concerned," Adrian said quietly, noticing the change in her expression. Sophie lowered her voice. "He is still watching." Adrian followed her glance briefly and saw Ryan standing beside the bar, holding a glass he had not yet touched. Adrian returned his attention to Sophie without breaking the rhythm of the dance. "Let him watch," he replied calmly. Sophie hesitated. "You do not know Ryan the way I do." Adrian's expression remained composed. "Then tell me," he said gently. Sophie sighed softly as they turned again across the dance floor beneath the golden lights. "Ryan does not like losing," she explained, "especially not in front of people he is trying to impress." Adrian nodded once as if he had expected that answer. "That explains the persistence." Sophie looked up at him with mild concern. He will not let this go easily. Adrian's voice stayed calm and measured. That may be true. Sophie studied his expression. You do not seem worried. Adrian gave a faint smile. Confidence often unsettles people who expect hesitation. Sophie laughed quietly at that. You talk like this is another business negotiation. Adrian considered the comment for a moment before answering. In some ways it is, he admitted. Ryan Mitchell walked into this evening expecting to control the conversation. Instead, he lost that control. Sophie glanced toward Ryan again. Sure enough, several people near the bar had begun quietly speaking with him, though their eyes continued drifting toward the dance floor. Sophie felt a small wave of discomfort. I think he is explaining his version of the story. Adrian shrugged slightly. Then we should make sure our version looks stronger. Sophie blinked. Stronger? Adrian guided her through a smooth turn as the music shifted slightly. Right. Now everyone here believes they witnessed the beginning of a romantic story, he said calmly. People enjoy believing stories like that. Sophie smiled faintly. So we keep giving them a good show. Adrian returned the smile briefly. Exactly. As they continued dancing, Sophie noticed that the attention around them was no longer subtle. Several guests were openly watching now, some smiling, others whispering with clear curiosity. The photographer near the edge of the room lifted his camera again, capturing another image of Adrian and Sophie moving gracefully across the floor. Sophie exhaled slowly. This is officially out of control. Adrian's voice remained steady. Control is relative. Sophie laughed quietly despite herself. The tension she had felt earlier around Ryan was slowly being replaced by something else entirely. Dancing with Adrian felt surprisingly natural, and the calm confidence he carried seemed to push the rest of the chaos to the edges of the room. As the song neared its final notes, Adrian slowed their movement slightly and looked down at her with thoughtful curiosity. You are smiling now, he observed. Sophie realized he was right. I guess I am, she admitted. Adrian nodded gently. That makes the story more believable. The music faded and couples around them began applauding softly before drifting away from the dance floor. Adrian released Sophie's hand politely, but before either of them could step away, a sudden flash of light came from the edge of the room. The photographer from Business Weekly lowered his camera with a satisfied grin, and Sophie suddenly realized the photograph he had just taken would almost certainly appear in tomorrow morning's news. The bright flash from the camera faded quickly, but the impact of the moment remained. Sophie Carter blinked once as the photographer lowered his camera with clear satisfaction, already checking the image on the small screen as if he had just captured the most valuable shot of the evening. Around the edge of the dance floor, a few guests whispered again, their curiosity now openly visible. Sophie let out a quiet breath and looked toward Adrian Blake. That picture is going to be everywhere tomorrow, she said softly. Adrian followed her gaze toward the photographer, then calmly adjusted the cuff of his jacket as if the situation had been entirely expected. Most likely, he replied. Sophie shook her head slightly in disbelief. You are taking this very calmly for someone who just became the center of a public relationship story. Adrian looked back at her with a faint, thoughtful smile. Public attention tends to exaggerate small moments, he said. The best response is not to appear surprised by it. Sophie laughed quietly. I wish I had that skill. Adrian glanced around the ballroom where conversations had begun to resume, though many guests were still clearly aware of them. You handled tonight better than you think, he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow. I created the entire situation. Adrian nodded slightly. Yes, but you also stayed composed when it became complicated. Sophie considered that for a moment, though her attention was suddenly pulled toward the far side of the room again. Ryan Mitchell was no longer standing near the bar. Instead, he was speaking with two men Sophie did not recognize, both dressed in expensive suits. The conversation looked serious. Sophie frowned slightly. He is still not happy, she murmured. Adrian followed her gaze. Ryan noticed them looking and gave a polite nod that did not quite reach his eyes before turning back to his conversation. Adrian's voice remained calm. Ryan Mitchell seems like someone who values reputation. Sophie nodded slowly. More than almost anything. Adrian considered that information for a moment. Then losing face tonight will likely bother him. Sophie sighed softly. That means he will try to recover somehow. Adrian did not seem surprised. Possibly by changing the narrative. Sophie looked up at him. You really do think like a strategist. Adrian gave a small shrug. Years of board meetings. The music from the band shifted into a livelier tune and guests began returning to the dance floor again. Waiters moved through the room with trays of sparkling drinks while laughter and conversation gradually replaced the earlier tension. For the first time all evening, Sophie felt the atmosphere returning to something close to normal. Claire Matthews approached them again from across the ballroom, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. She handed one to Sophie and the other to Adrian. "You two have officially become the most interesting story of the gala," Claire said calmly. Sophie groaned quietly. "Please do not say that." Claire smiled faintly. "Relax. Most people here are enjoying the romance angle." Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "Romance angle?" Claire nodded toward the photographer who was now speaking with a reporter near the edge of the room. "Trust me, by morning the headline will probably describe the moment as charming." Sophie looked between them both. "I still cannot believe we are letting this story exist." Claire gave a small practical shrug. "Sometimes the easiest way to control a rumor is to guide it." Adrian nodded once in agreement. Sophie was about to respond when a voice suddenly spoke from behind them again. "I have to admit," Ryan Mitchell said calmly, stepping forward with a polite smile that looked carefully practiced, "you two are putting on a very convincing performance tonight." Ryan Mitchell's voice carried a calm politeness, but the tension beneath it was impossible to miss. Sophie Carter slowly turned toward him, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass of sparkling water Claire had handed her moments earlier. Adrian Blake remained beside her with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout the evening. Claire Matthews watched the exchange carefully, but chose not to interrupt. Ryan offered a small, practiced smile as he stepped closer. "I have to give you both credit," he continued smoothly. "Most people would not have handled a surprise encounter the way you did tonight." Sophie forced a polite expression. "It was not exactly planned," she said. Ryan nodded lightly, as though the explanation amused him. That much was obvious. His eyes moved briefly toward Adrian. "Although I will admit the balcony moment was impressive." Adrian's expression remained calm. Sometimes situations require decisive actions. Ryan chuckled quietly. Decisive indeed. For a second, he studied the two of them again, the way someone might examine a puzzle that still did not fully make sense. "You know," Ryan continued, "Sophie and I used to talk about events like this. She always said she felt out of place around people who measured success by the size of their companies." Sophie felt a flicker of irritation but kept her tone even. "People grow, Ryan." Ryan nodded slowly. "That they do." His attention returned to Adrian. "You must be a very convincing influence." Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. "Sophie makes her own decisions." Ryan's smile tightened slightly at that response. Around them, the music continued and guests drifted through the ballroom, though several nearby were clearly listening with quiet curiosity. Claire took a small sip of her drink and spoke for the first time since Ryan approached. "Ryan," she said calmly, "it looks like the evening is keeping everyone entertained." Ryan glanced toward her. "I would say so." Claire's tone remained polite but firm. "The charity committee is announcing the next round of donations in a few minutes. You may want to find your seat." Ryan looked back at Adrian and Sophie for a moment longer before shrugging lightly. "Of course," he said. "I would not want to distract from the event." As he stepped away, he paused briefly beside Sophie, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear the final comment. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts." Then he turned and walked toward the front of the ballroom where the stage lights were beginning to brighten. Sophie watched him go, her expression thoughtful. Adrian spoke quietly beside her. "He is still trying to regain control of the situation." Sophie nodded slowly. "That sounds like Ryan." Claire glanced toward the stage where the event host was preparing to speak. "Well, tonight he is not the one people are watching." Sophie sighed softly. "That does not make me feel better." Adrian looked toward the stage as the microphone crackled gently and the room began to quiet. "Then perhaps we should focus on the purpose of the evening," he said. Sophie followed his gaze. The charity organizer was stepping forward to announce the largest donors of the night. Claire leaned slightly closer to them. "If either of you are planning to disappear before the press starts asking questions," she whispered, "now would be a good time." Adrian considered that suggestion for a moment. Then he glanced down at Sophie with a thoughtful expression that carried a quiet hint of amusement. "What do you think?" he asked softly. "Should we leave before the story grows any bigger?" Sophie Carter looked toward the stage where the charity organizer was beginning to speak into the microphone, the room gradually quieting as guests turned their attention forward. The soft glow of the ballroom lights reflected across the polished floor, while waiters moved quietly along the edges of the room, collecting empty glasses. For the first time that evening, the attention of the crowd shifted away from her and Adrian Blake. Sophie released a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding. Leaving suddenly might make the story even bigger, she said quietly. Adrian considered that for a moment, his gaze still directed toward the stage where the host was. Thanking sponsors and donors. You may be right, he admitted. Claire Matthews glanced between them with practical curiosity. Then you might as well stay long enough to look comfortable, she said. Sophie gave a small laugh. Comfortable might be a challenge tonight. Adrian turned slightly toward her. You have handled every unexpected moment so far, he replied calmly. One more will not hurt. The charity organizer finished announcing the donation totals, and applause filled the ballroom. Sophie joined the applause politely, though her thoughts were still catching up with everything that had happened since she first stepped into the hotel that evening. When the clapping faded, the music began again and guests slowly returned to their conversations. Claire checked the time on her phone. I should make sure the board members do not panic over tomorrow's headlines, she said with a small smile. She looked at Sophie reassuringly. Try to enjoy the rest of the evening. With that, she stepped away into the crowd, leaving Adrian and Sophie standing near the edge of the dance floor again. Sophie watched the guests moving around the room before finally turning back toward Adrian. This was supposed to be a 10-minute delivery of paperwork, she said. Adrian allowed a quiet smile. Unexpected events tend to reshape plans. Sophie shook her head slightly, though a small amused expression crossed her face. I never imagined pretending to date my boss would become the highlight of a charity gala. Adrian studied her thoughtfully. It seems the story convinced most people. Sophie glanced toward the photographer who was now speaking with the Business Weekly reporter again. Yes, she said softly. A little too well. Adrian followed her gaze before returning his attention to her. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade slightly around them. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I do not regret helping you tonight. Sophie met his eyes. Even with the headlines that are probably coming tomorrow? Adrian nodded calmly. Even with those. Sophie smiled faintly at that response. You know, she said after a moment, the strange part is that the night does not feel like a disaster anymore. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. No. Sophie shook her head. Not really. Adrian glanced toward the dance floor where couples were moving again beneath the warm lights. Then he looked back at her with a thoughtful calmness. That felt genuine rather than strategic. Sometimes unexpected stories turn out better than the ones we plan, he said. Sophie laughed softly. Are you saying this story might not be finished yet? Adrian met her gaze for a quiet second before answering with the same steady confidence he had carried all evening. I think, he said gently. That depends on whether you would like the story to continue. Sophie looked around the ballroom once more before returning her attention to him, her earlier nervousness replaced by a small curious smile. Maybe, she said lightly, we should see what happens after the headlines tomorrow. Adrian nodded once, and as the music carried softly through the room, the strange story that had begun with a simple line no longer felt like a performance at all. At a glittering charity gala, a young assistant unexpectedly comes face to face with her ex-boyfriend, and in a moment of panic, she introduces her powerful boss as her boyfriend. What begins as a simple lie quickly turns into one of the most unforgettable millionaire stories, as the confident CEO decides to play along and protect her dignity in front of a crowd of investors and reporters. When the ex challenges the truth of their relationship, the millionaire responds with calm authority and a single unexpected kiss that changes the entire atmosphere of the evening. Whispers begin to spread across the ballroom, while cameras capture the moment, and suddenly the assistant and the billionaire find themselves at the center of attention as guests, investors, and the press watch their every move. Determined not to lose control of the situation, the millionaire leads the assistant onto the dance floor, turning the rumor into a believable story, while the jealous ex tries to recover his pride. This emotional and elegant drama unfolds through a night filled with tension, charm, and quiet strategy, as two very different people learn to navigate reputation, pride, and unexpected connection in front of an audience that loves a good romance. The assistant slowly realizes that the billionaire's calm confidence is not only protecting her, but also revealing a side of him the public rarely sees. While the ex struggles to regain control of a story that no longer belongs to him, moments of conversation, dance, and public curiosity transform what began as a desperate lie into one of those rare millionaire stories where dignity, intelligence, and composure win over arrogance. As cameras flash and headlines begin forming, the assistant and the billionaire must decide whether the story they created for the crowd should end when the gala ends or continue beyond the spotlight. Filled with elegant tension, social intrigue, and subtle emotional shifts, this narrative captures the charm that makes millionaire stories so captivating while showing how one unexpected moment between a confident CEO and a determined assistant can evolve into something far more meaningful than either of them planned. Viewers who enjoy romantic drama, social power dynamics, and sophisticated millionaire stories will find themselves drawn into the quiet chemistry between the assistant and the billionaire as the night unfolds under ballroom lights. By the time the music fades and the crowd begins to leave, the question remains whether the story that began as a performance will disappear with the headlines or become one of those unforgettable millionaire stories that change two lives forever. Character 1. White male billionaire CEO, age 34, elegant black tuxedo and crisp white shirt, confident posture, calm intelligent expression, well-groomed dark hair, clean-shaven, cinematic lighting, front-facing portrait, realistic photography style. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, natural skin texture, professional charismatic presence. Character 2. White female assistant, age 26, elegant navy evening dress, soft natural makeup, expressive kind eyes, shoulder-length light brown hair, gentle confident smile, front-facing portrait, realistic photography style. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, natural skin texture, professional appearance.